Okay, this is just a quick unedited video on how to perform a splice on the Magicshine cables. The problem is right in here where you have a solder joint between the positive conductor and the center conductor on the cable. They can occasionally not be a good joint, and over time they break and then the wires toast, so you got to replace that connector. So first thing you do is assemble all the necessary tools here. You got a soldering iron. Doesn't have to be a nice fancy one. It can just be a 40-watt plug-in, real cheap, probably less than $10 at Harbor Freight. Need something for stripping wire. I've got these nice automatic strippers here, which are pretty nice. You need two different sizes of heat shrink. You need the smaller size here for the inner conductor wires, and then you need an outer piece to cover the whole job. So those inner pieces need to be about 1/2 inch, and the outer piece you can be pretty generous, maybe 2.5 inches long. So, oh yes, and we need a heat gun for shrinking that. So if you don't have a heat gun, you can use a lighter and let the heat rising off the flame, shrink the tubing, but you really have to be careful doing that not to melt it. But a hairdryer will not be hot enough. Alright, so let's strip the outer sheath. Be careful not to nick the inner conductor wires at all. So we'll do that on both sides. So I've got a little over 1 inch worth of wire now on the two halves that need to be spliced. Now the thing is, you got to have enough room on these wires for your heat shrink, and you still need enough room to work with the wire. So I'm going to go strip off down to the heat shrink there. Do the same thing on the other side. Actually, the other side can be a little bit shorter. You just need one side to be long enough to hold your heat shrink tubing. Take just a little bit more off that one. Alright, so I've got one side with longer wires, about 1/2 inch of exposed wire. Another side with shorter wires. Okay. Just want to make sure you take your time and get those as even as you can. This is what happens when you work with a very short piece of wire. You can actually pull those out. That's what happened to me just now. Alright, so go ahead and first things first, put your outer heat shrink on. Don't forget. Otherwise you'll be cutting it and starting over. Alright, then twist these wires up a little bit so that they don't fray on you. Alright. Then slip your heat shrink over the two longer side. Now go ahead and line the two halves up and just twist those together. Alright, so got your heat shrink on. You want to keep that as far down away from the wire as possible so that the heat going through the wire does not shrink that before you're ready for it to be shrunk. Alright, so now I'm going to take my solder, and the trick to soldering really is you want to put the heat on the wire and let the wire melt the solder. And once you get a little solder flowing onto the wire, as long as it's coated all the way around, you're good to go. You don't want to soak the whole wire because we need it to bend. I'll show you. Alright, so I got some solder flowing all the way around. That's a good solder joint. And I didn't have the heat on long enough to start, well, a little bit it did, but if you keep the iron on too long, it'll shrink your tubing, which you don't want to have happen. Alright, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to fold these wires. Actually, I'm going to have to cut them down to length. You want to make sure that you don't cut away all the solder. So there you have a nice clean solder joint, flowed all the way around. Now you're going to fold it over on itself. That's where it's very important to have not nicked the wires when you stripped it, because if they're nicked, then they'll break when you do that. But if you stripped it without nicking it, then you can fold them and slide your heat shrink over. It can be a little tricky if the heat shrink is a little undersized, or if it started to shrink on you like this one did. Alright, but we got it. Just want to make sure that that solder joint is completely underneath the heat shrink. Alright, so now we've got about an inch worth of exposed cable. I'm going to go ahead and shrink these. Alright, so there's the basic repair. One thing I like to do, just to help it look a little better, is I like to use some of this butyl rubber. This is the same stuff you use on your car windshields to actually install a windshield. You get it at auto parts stores. You don't want to go buy a whole roll of this just to do this job. It's pretty expensive, but if you have some or can get your hands on some, it's really good. It never dries out. It's very sticky. It's extremely waterproof. So I like to put a little bit of this around the wire, kind of mold it. Mold it all the way around that wire. I won't take the time to go all the way, but you get the idea. Kind of seal up the edges. So now no water or moisture can get into that connection whatsoever. And then last but not least, take your larger piece of heat shrink that you already put on there, slide it over past the sticky stuff. So we got to get it small enough so that it'll go over it. It's kind of tricky. Actually going to go from the other side since the hole is bigger on that side. There we go. Get the joint right in the middle and shrink it up. Okay, there you have it. A fairly nice looking splice that is flexible, waterproof, and should outlast the rest of the system there. Hope that helps.